Morning to begin our day with one of our Bible faculty members who is more than just a Bible faculty member on this campus, I can tell you. It not only because he's been appointed to another very weighty responsibility of the Dean of Students, probably the most intense job on this campus during the school year, but also because he and his family have had such a profound impact upon our school. We're thrilled to have Jason Longstreth and Stephanie and their family as a part of our family, and that he is speaking to us this morning on the subject that he is. I think he and his wife would be a perfect example of being fruitful and multiplying. The spiritual purpose of procreation. So I thought I should name for you their children. They have 5 children: Hannah, Kira, Jonathan, Alexander, and Olivia. And I'm sure most of you know that the majority of those children have been adopted by this precious couple, and that they also have adopted some children that have special needs. I love the illustration on our campus for our students of this good family and what they represent. Jason has also achieved a number of good things in the academic world. Of course, he first graduated here, received his advanced diploma, went on to Johnson University to get his MA, Amridge to get his Master of Divinity, and Doctor of Ministry in 2014. So he's taught as our adjunct professor for some time years ago, came back to join our full-time faculty in 2008, and in 2014 became our Dean of Students. What's more precious about the family is that they represent what family means on this campus and what it means to let your heart go out to children. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you this morning Brother Jason Longstreth to begin our day talking about the subject at hand: be fruitful and multiply, the spiritual purpose of procreation. Brother Jason.
Well, I want to begin this morning by expressing my appreciation to those who thanked me for my lesson Monday night. I have passed most of those thanks on to Doy Moyer. I know we look quite a bit alike. That has happened several times in the last few days. We wear our hair the same way and everything. But seriously, I appreciate the opportunity to be before you this morning to talk about be fruitful and multiply, the spiritual purpose of procreation. And yet I do find this a little bit odd in some ways. Generally speaking, there is a rule concerning the biblical studies departmental meetings here at the college, and the rule is don't miss meetings. In fact, I could go further to say don't step out in the middle of meetings, or you may end up with extra assignments given to you. You may end up even speaking on a lectureship dealing with a topic that you didn't choose. And I've seen that happen before. But on this occasion, that's not exactly what happened. I was in the room, and yet there still was a strange, almost pre-planned way in which my name was put forward and agreed to before I even had a chance to respond. And I don't know if that was planned or not, but the fact that I was chosen to discuss this topic seems strange to me for a couple of reasons. That first, although my wife Stephanie and I do have 5 children, that really is not the direct result of our personal multiplication from a procreation standpoint. We have 5 children, but 4 of them are adopted. So I thought multiplication by procreation is not really an area in which we have a lot of experience. There are 2 of us, and we have biologically produced 1 child. I am not as good at math as President Payne is, but I don't think that's a really high multiplication rate when it comes from that standpoint. And yet another reason that it seemed kind of strange to me is because while I was sitting right there in the Biblical Studies departmental meeting, across the table from me in the room was Tom Hamilton. And Tom Hamilton has fathered a clan. And so certainly, if there's somebody who would be more qualified to talk about procreation and being fruitful and multiplying, that would be Tom. And yet, nonetheless, I was given this topic, and I received that. And as we tell our children, you get what you get, and you don't throw a fit. And so this morning, I do want to talk to you about this important topic, the idea of procreation and the spiritual purpose behind it. But the third matter that I found a little bit strange, and one that has more to do with this morning's topic than the other two, is that one of the reasons that I was chosen for this topic is because I have a large family. Now, it's not as large as the Hamiltons, but it's clear that our society believes it to be a large family. That when they look at us with our 5 children, we're too big to fit in a hotel room. We can't have a normal-sized car. It's difficult to get a table at a restaurant if you go out to eat. We have a van for transportation, not a minivan. Those minivans are cute for the mini families. You know, we have a real van. We have the smaller version that only seats 12. But, you know, you have to have these vehicles, and when you look at us from the world's standpoint, they clearly believe that this is a large family, that this is something unusual to them. When people ask me if I have children, and I respond that I do, they ask how many, and I say 5, I oftentimes get a reaction that's difficult to describe. There's kind of a strange look on people's faces, something between horror and pity, with maybe a touch of bewilderment or confusion. Not really sure what happened there. Should I feel sorry for you? Did you do something wrong? You know, I'm kind of familiar with the look. Up until last year, it was the same look I got when I told people I was a Chicago Cubs fan. You know, it was the same. I don't really understand why you would choose to do that. And of course, my wife has received similar reactions from people. She's sometimes out with our children, and someone will look at her for a few minutes, and then someone might approach her and say, "Are they all yours?" I asked that question. She said, "Well, I think so." I mean, it's kind of tough to keep track of all of them. They do look familiar. I think I've seen them before. I mean, they probably do belong to us. It seems about right. But after people find out that you have 5 children, there's the inevitable follow-up question. And some of you who have large families know what that follow-up question is. Did you intend to have this many children? I mean, did this happen on purpose? You actually wanted this many children? Or, I mean, surely something, again, happened beyond your control. Then they have encouraging comments like, "Wow," or "You must be a glutton for punishment," or "More power to you," or "Boy, you must not have any life at all." And you know, those kinds of questions that follow are the typical reactions that we receive. But this morning, we're discussing the first command that God gave to humanity in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." And of course, that's the basis for our study this morning. And yet I want to begin by asking you a question. Does it surprise you that mankind takes this first command from God and responds with the question, why? That we respond in that way when God would say, "Be fruitful and multiply," and maybe like our children, if we have children often do, when we tell them to do something, they ask, "Why do I have to do that?" I mean, well, what's the purpose behind that? Why would I have to engage in this type of activity? Why should we be fruitful and multiply? And does it really shock any of us that human beings ignore the commandment that God has given, or they don't see the value in it? I really doubt that it does, especially with this audience. It's not surprising that God gives a commandment and people respond, "I don't think I need to do that." That God would tell us to do something and we kind of question what the value of that is. It's not something new for us to learn that people seem to think that God's commandment will be detrimental to their life instead of beneficial. I mean, I don't think that should be new to us. And yet that's what's happening in our culture. In the lecture book, I discussed that we have this anti-child mentality, this small family mentality that has permeated our society, not quite as much in the Lord's church. I think our families on a whole are probably still larger than the average family in America. But this idea of believing that being fruitful and multiplying will in some way be harmful to us, will be detrimental to us as human beings, that our life will be worse if we follow that commandment, is something that's been done from the very beginning. I mean, that's the same tactic that Satan used in the Garden of Eden when he tempted Eve. He told Eve that God had prohibited her from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because if she did, it would make her life better. He made her question God's command. He made her question God's motive, and he encouraged her to do the opposite of what God said to do. Satan implied that God did not want Adam and Eve to be happy, and that if they followed God's command, their life would be less than what it could be otherwise. And I would suggest to you that the same approach is being taken today. When we examine our current culture, and when we examine current attitudes towards children, that our culture asks why we should have children. That it challenges God's command, and it presents children as something that will make our life less than what it could have been otherwise. Certainly if you have many children, that you have no life, that you certainly aren't able to do as many things. You can't have as many things. And in a culture that obsessed with extreme individualism and personal pleasure and selfishness and materialism, children are certainly seen as a liability. There's something that will get in the way of your personal pleasure. There's something that will get in the way of your material belongings. They're going to take your time away, and they're going to cost you so much. And oftentimes when articles appear in the news regarding children, that's what they focus on more than anything else. A recent study was conducted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was publicized just last month, where they talked about the average cost of raising a child. Now, they do that every year. What does it cost to raise a child from birth to adulthood? In this particular study, they went from birth to age 17. Now, I don't know why they cut off at age 17, but that's what they did. And they said not including the pregnancy-related costs, or maybe the adoption-related costs, and not including the cost of college, they said for a middle-class family in the United States, the average cost of raising a child to age 17 is $234,000. And the study said that if you include the cost of pregnancy and college, you could easily add on another 25% to that $234,000. Now, $234,000, I have 5 children, that's $1.17 million. I don't need to add the other 25%. That is enough to give me the look of horror and bewilderment on my own face. And you respond 1.1, and I need to talk to President Payne. We're going to have to make out some arrangements here. But that's just part of why people don't want to have children or have as many children today as they did in past years. They're looked at it this way, and a child has a dollar amount associated with them, and raising children, that's what it costs you. That's what it takes away from you. But I also want you to realize that this is something that is relatively new in our culture. Not very long ago, 5 children would not have been considered that unusual. In fact, it was common for families to have 6, 7, 8, 9 children. I mean, just a generation ago, a couple of generations ago, there's many in this room that can remember that. There are still some among Christians that have those kinds of families. But our culture has changed. And to help us understand some of those changes, I want to turn your attention to some information that I found in an article that was published in 2006 by a man named Cohen, and it was entitled, "Why Have Children?" And this article examined the issue of falling birth rates and attitudes toward children, and it has some very enlightening observations that I want to share with you. The article states the most affluent, most advanced, freest societies of the world are not having enough children to sustain themselves. In other words, much of the world is experiencing a population bust. And even though the overall population of the earth continues to rise, that population growth is limited to specific geographic regions or areas, with most of the growth occurring in less advanced and more religious parts of the globe. Now, I don't want to bore you. I know it's early in the morning, on the 3rd day of getting up early in the morning, but I do want to share some statistics with you. Because in this article, he reveals from the 1950s until 2006, which again a decade ago, but that's when the article was published, the fertility rate in Europe as a whole fell from 2.7 children per couple to 1.38 children per couple. Now, that statistic doesn't mean much unless you know the number of children per couple that is needed to sustain a population. And that's what they're talking about. That much of the world is not even having enough children to sustain their population. Well, it's estimated that the average couple needs to have 2.1 children in order to sustain the population. to make up for those who don't get married, to make up for other situations, to make up for deaths. If you've got two married people, they need to have 2.1 children in order to just maintain the status quo. So when the fertility rate in Europe as a whole fell from 2.7 to 1.38, that means that Europe's fertility rate had fallen to 34% below the average number of children per couple that is needed to sustain the population. During the same time period, Japan's fertility rate fell to 1.32. Russia, Spain, Italy, South Korea, and the Czech Republic had fertility rates between 1.0 and 1.3. And the article states, as a result of this, generations of children are growing up without brothers or sisters, and a sizable percentage of men and women in the most advanced nations will never have any children at all. Now, the purpose for this article might be a little bit different than our purpose today. And they're not just worried about someone not having a brother or sister, as if missing out on the pain game, which was my brother's favorite game to play. He's older than me, and let's play the pain game. And okay, it didn't end well. Or, having sisters who would feather your hair and take pictures to show their friends, which may or may not have had something to do with all my hair falling out. That's not really what's concerning them, that you're growing up without brothers and sisters and you're missing out on that interaction that brothers and sisters can have. They also say in these articles that this population drop will have a direct impact on societies and cultures in other ways. And of course, what they're driving at largely is economic. And when you look at some of the articles that have been published lately in the United States, the same type of concern is there. By the way, as near as I can tell, the most recent numbers for the United States population rate, the birth rate, which has usually been considerably higher than Europe and in other places, it has dropped to 1.8 children. 1.8, we are not sustaining the population. You say the United States is growing. Well, we'll wait till after the wall. We'll see what happens there. The United States is growing, but our birth rate in the United States is not. It is in a decline. And an article on August 12, 2016 in The Week magazine had the title, the heading, "America's Birth Rate is Now a National Emergency." The article begins, "The new birth numbers are out and they're a disaster. There are now 59.6 births per 1,000 women in the United States. The lowest rate ever recorded in the United States." A previous article published on May 23, 2016 was entitled, "Why America is About to Start Freaking Out About Babies." We are not having enough babies to sustain our population. And a May 10, 2016 article on the Quartz website was entitled, "Americans Have Stopped Having Babies." And what many of these articles point out is that with a shrinking population and an aging population, economists are concerned that there will be fewer taxpayers to pay into the system, and as a result, taxes have to increase or services must be cut. And certainly that is something concerning for a nation. But the greater concern is a cultural issue, which Cohen also acknowledges, as do some of the other articles that I mentioned. They even tie population growth or decrease in population with the confidence level that some have in their own culture or society. And they say if the birth rate drops, then typically people don't believe in their culture. If the birth rate rises, people are generally optimistic. I'd say, well, that might be the case. And when people have better jobs, when things are going better, that maybe, you could see, and what they're sometimes saying is, if we could just kind of kickstart this economy again, people will start having babies again. And that's what's holding them back. It's the $234,000 per child that somebody's looking and they can't get a job and they can't get a raise, and they're simply making the decision that I can't afford children. But we're not the first civilization to have experienced this. And I'm not sure that it's so directly tied to that economic picture, at least insofar as recessions or recoveries are concerned, that it really makes the most difference. If you go back in history, you can look at Polybius, who was a Greek historian. He lived in the 2nd century BC. He had some interesting things to say about his culture. Now, writing again around 150 BC, here's what he said about the Greek culture. He said, "In our own time, the whole of Greece has been subject to a low birth rate and a general decrease of the population, owing to which cities have become deserted and the land has ceased to yield fruit." Now, apparently, he was worried about the economic impact of this low birth rate. But what's causing this to happen? This is where it gets interesting with Polybius. Here's what he said. For as men had fallen into a state of pretentiousness, avarice, and indolence, that they do not wish to marry, or if they married, to rear children born to them, or at most, as a rule, one or two of them, the evil rapidly and insensibly grew. And what Polybius was smart enough to recognize in the 2nd century BC is that it was pride and greed and laziness that led to Greece having a low birth rate. It wasn't that they couldn't afford it. It was that Greek men had reached a point where their own personal pleasure and their pride and their possessions and their desire to not have to work hard had led them to not get married. If they do get married, not have children. If they do have children, at the most one or two. But that's all that we want to do. And it had had a negative impact on their culture. That the citizens of Greece were simply unwilling to make the sacrifices that are involved in rearing children. And I'd suggest to you that that might be a whole lot closer to our situation today than anything else. That our pride and our greed and our dislike for hard work are clearly in play here, because children take away from self. And you can't deny that. They take our money, they take our time, they take the TV remote. You can't find where it is. You can't watch what you want to on TV. They're a lot of work. Polybius recognized this. And in our culture, this tendency, our selfishness, is not only leading to childishness, it's leading to childlessness. That as people act more childish in their own desires and what they want, they don't want to bring other children into the world. They're still a child themselves. And while Cohen in his study didn't argue that birth rates in the U.S. had fallen because of pride and materialism and laziness, although I think he could have, he did identify 3 factors that he believed play a part in this. First, he said there is no longer any negative stigma associated with women not having children. Now, that could be a good thing. I know women who can't have children, they have been barren. Oftentimes in society, they have felt like they are worth less. They felt like they can't fulfill their purpose. They've been kind of an outcast of society. But the point he makes, this is different now than how it had been throughout history. In the past, women who didn't have children didn't feel like they were fulfilling their responsibility or purpose in life. Now women don't need children to find worth, and that's oftentimes what they'll tell you. I don't feel like I have to have a child in order to have worth or value. Well, nobody was saying that before, but it is shifting a focus off of having children. Second, he says children are now considered economic liabilities rather than assets. Now, we've already discussed that to some extent. Your children nowadays don't make you money like they have in years past. You know, that in the past, the idea of having more children, well, you lived on the farm and they're going to work on the farm. You know, they can work in the family business. That children economically were a positive thing. Now children are viewed as a negative thing. And the third factor, he says, is that birth control has been practically perfected so that individuals may engage in sexual activity at will without the consequence of pregnancy. That you can still have as much sexual activity as you want, and you don't have the oops as often. It's not going to lead to a child being born. And Cohen said, children are thus culturally optional, economically burdensome, and technologically avoidable. And if they're optional and burdensome and avoidable, is it any surprise that many people would choose not to have them? That given the impact that children have on their lives, that's the choice that they would make. And if you add to this the influence of feminism and the impact of environmentalism, both of which contribute to a decreased birth rate, the picture looks pretty bleak. You can understand what's happening in Europe and in America and in those advanced Western cultures and civilizations. And yet I'm not convinced that these have the greatest impact on Christian families. Again, I've already mentioned that our families have a tendency to be larger already. And I'm not sure we're looking at these things in the same way that the world looks at these things. However, there are 2 other things that Cohen mentioned in his article that I think may have a greater influence. First, he does point out that parenting is not easy. And that would probably be the easiest thing to get an amen if I were that kind of preacher. You know, parenting's not easy. Can I get an amen? Well, the parents are asleep right now, so they probably couldn't. But somebody who's gone through it, they recognize that parenting is a labor, a constant outlay of time and energy, a burden of expenses, a limiting of personal freedom, and that for many the price is simply too high. To care for a child throughout all those years, for 2 decades or longer, to care for a child throughout their life and to have that loss of personal freedom. And again, as the studies look at these things, people who have children are twice as likely to file for bankruptcy as people who don't. They have a greater chance of facing foreclosure on their houses. They have higher rates of depression than people who don't have children, at least according to the studies that have been done. And those statistics, again, they might make me feel broke and depressed right now. And so if you want to be happy and wealthy, don't have children. That's the message that's coming out from our culture today. If you want to enjoy life to its fullest, don't have children. If you feel that you have to have children, have one. Maybe you can squeak by. Maybe 2. You want one of both. With our gender problems, I don't know how many you need to have now. Maybe you do need to have 6 or 7. Have all the genders represented in your family. Whatever genders happen to be there and whatever approach they may have. But additionally, Cohen pointed out, so that's one of the things that parenting's hard. He also pointed out that many parents in America are not necessarily driven by selfishness or personal ambition, but they are motivated by the desire to provide the best for the children that they have. They want their children to have the best schools, the best medical care, the best houses, the best cars, the best clothing. And in order to provide this kind of life for some of their children, they have to reduce the number of children that they have. Fewer children equals a better life for their children. If we have 2, they can have really good stuff. If we have 3, they can't have as nice as stuff. If we have 4, maybe we can't feed them all. We can only feed some of them. And you're doing the reduction there, that we have to reduce our children. And it's argued, again, this is the case when it comes to material goods, but even more, an inheritance for the children to share. I have more children so they can split the debt when we're gone. It's not as big a burden on all of them. But this approach towards parenting is even sometimes argued when it comes to love or attention. And again, that's not necessarily bad. I don't think that's a bad motive. When someone says, well, I want to be able to spend time with each one of them. I want to make sure that they're cared for. On some level, there might be the implication that if you're having too many children, you can't possibly be a good parent to all of them. The less is more mentality that I'm not sure many of us would verbalize, but maybe mentally we've accepted some of that. Some of that idea that we can't provide for all of these children. And if all of this were true, why wouldn't someone choose to have no children, or at the most 1 or 2 children? And if we view things from a purely physical perspective, I think that makes sense. But if we view things from a spiritual perspective, a biblical perspective, another picture emerges. That children are a blessing. And they're a commandment. And when God gave the first commandment in Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, if I ask you, why did he give that commandment? You might say, wait a minute, didn't you say we're not supposed to ask why? God said do this. Why? Well, this is a different kind of why. Not trying to get out of it, but trying to understand it. Was it just a physical command based on the fact that there were too few people to care for on the earth? Did God just want more gardeners for the earth? And maybe that same situation doesn't exist now. I think that would be possible. And some have argued that type of a position. They had to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We've already filled the earth. Doesn't apply now. He told Noah after the flood, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Well, again, they were down to just 8 people, and so they had to expand that. When they entered in the promised land, God allowed them to slowly take possession of the promised land in Exodus 23, because there weren't enough of them yet to fill the whole land, and he didn't want it to fall into the wild, and you need to have more people. And so maybe this more people approach is just because of a physical need at the time, since we now have overpopulation, and we're not in danger of not subduing the earth and having the earth go wild, that this commandment would no longer be valid. But I would suggest to you that this command, while certainly having a physical component to it, is ultimately a spiritual commandment. And I think that's even hinted at to some degree in 1 Timothy chapter 2:15 when the word saved is used. 1 Timothy 2:15 has already been mentioned in previous lectures. It reads, yet she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. I know some speakers may get a little bit nervous if one of their main texts was used by someone else. I think, what will I have to speak about? I got pretty excited. I thought I may not have to talk about this passage. If other people have already explained it fully in describing the role of the woman here and being saved through childbirth, then maybe I could just kind of avoid that one. Because it's one of those passages that has a bunch of different interpretations and applications, at times very little agreement on it. One commentator suggested 1 Timothy 2:15, like few other passages in the New Testament, is almost embarrassing in the attention it draws to itself. Now, I know something about drawing attention to myself, and I know something about embarrassment. I'm not sure how a scripture draws too much attention to itself, and it becomes embarrassing in what it says. I do know that there's a lot of confusion about what this passage says, and some take it and they make it say whatever they want it to say. That she shall be saved through childbearing, and doesn't really explain how that's done. And so you're kind of free to run all over the place with it, and explain, well, is this about Mary? Is this about Eve? Is this about women in general? Is it really talking about childbearing? Is it talking about just surviving the birthing process, as some translation seems to translate it? And you're kind of left to go any direction that you want. Now, it's not my favorite passage that does that. My favorite passage like that is the end of 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10. The end of 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10 is a great verse. In discussing gender roles and authority and the head covering, Paul just says, because of the angels, without explaining it further. That's great. I love that. I've started to insert that in all of my arguments. Why don't you use musical instruments in worship? Because of the angels. Why do you take the Lord's Supper the first day of every week? Because of the angels. And you just kind of throw it on there and doesn't really explain what that was all about. But in all seriousness, when he talks about women being saved through childbearing, I think I did a great job Monday night when I laid out the 2 or 3 main interpretations for 1 Timothy 2:15 that seem to make the most sense in the context, and they all involve the idea of salvation in some way. Now, it doesn't make much sense to me, at least, that this would just be about women physically surviving childbirth if they're faithful. But when this has maybe some reference to Mary, the woman through whom Christ entered the world, it has some reference to women who act faithfully within their realm of responsibility, being saved, doing what women are supposed to do, involving all of those things involved with women. But also when it is applied in some way to women having children, I think it's sufficient for our discussion to say that this passage does connect salvation with children in some way, and that there's a spiritual purpose there, as Porter stated. But regardless of what we may believe today about the roles and relations of men and women, and despite our best efforts to dismiss or obscure what the text says linguistically through ideologically or theologically dictated exegesis, the author of 1 Timothy apparently believed that for the woman who abides in faith, love, and holiness, her salvation will come by the bearing of children. That in some way, having children and salvation are connected. Having children and a spiritual purpose are connected. And Psalm 127 also connects children or childbearing with a greater purpose. With a spiritual purpose, Psalm 127 reads as follows: unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman keeps awake in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early, to retire late, to eat the bread and painful labors, for he gives to his beloved even in his sleep. Behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. Now, the setting of the psalm is generally considered to be the temple, or the rebuilding of the temple, and it's easily divided into 2 parts. Usually verses 1 and 2 focusing on the Lord building a house or guarding the city. But verses 3 through 5, which focus on children, are much more interesting in regard to our discussion this morning. And the way verses 3 through 5 fit into the overall context of the psalm can change the specific application that we make from this psalm. For example, if the main point in Psalm 127 is found in verse 1, the idea of a watchman or the Lord guarding the city, then perhaps the children being a gift of the Lord is a reference to the fact that children can be used as a defense, that our sons grow up to be soldiers and the next generation will take their place defending the people of God. And that's what many commentators argue. Fleming says the psalm reassures the community of Yahweh's continuing care for his people, with the tangible proof in the children he has provided for its continuing strength. Psalm 127 displays God's gift to an anxious people, sleep instead of torment, and sons to take their part in the conflict as Yahweh's own weaponry. And that presents the idea of children as the front line of defense, so the people of God may resist their enemies and can stand in the presence of persecution and affliction. And certainly if that's the case, we would want to have as many children as possible. We often comment on the fact that our children, the next generation, are the future of the church. And we're right about that. You know, that next generation coming up to take their place, the young men and women to stand in the gap and hold firm so that the church can survive and can grow and can thrive in the world. That's a very appealing interpretation. However, if you listen to a slightly different interpretation based on the use of the arrow imagery, where he says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. How blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Estes argues that Philo specifically includes arrows in a list of missile weapons as contrasted with defensive and therefore implicitly offensive. And what he's saying there is arrows are great at attacking your enemies. They're not so great at defense. And when the Psalm's using our children and talking about them being arrows, the arrows shot from the bow are propelled toward a remote target according to the desire of the archer. He says, so children, when properly nurtured, extend the effect of their father into human society of the next generation. How happy is the man whose children are prepared to stand their ground. That the children can take the battle out there to the enemy, not just standing their ground here, but actually advancing the cause. And that's a compelling argument. Because what our children do is they allow us to influence the world. And on some level, they allow us to fill the world and subdue it. And if you think about subduing it from a spiritual standpoint, that's a little different image. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Fill the world and subdue it. Bring it into accordance with what God wants done. Our children are our primary weapon. And for the Christian, there's a unique opportunity here. Because if we're worried about the direction this world is going, if we're concerned about the immorality and the darkness that exists, we shouldn't react like those in the world react. They wring their hands. They ask, how can you bring a child into this world? Well, you've heard that question before. How could anybody in their right mind bring a child into this world the way that it is? Well, when we look at this, we don't see it the same way. We look at a lost world that's headed in the wrong direction. And we recognize that we don't need fewer people in the world. We need more godly children in the world. We have a chance to impact this for good. And when we talk about wanting to be able to go out there and save the world, I know this doesn't replace other forms of evangelism, but let me tell you something, having children is a form of evangelism. You teach them the gospel. You bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I'm not going to get into the next lecture. I'll get hit in the head with a book. They'll come flying at me from the next lecture speaker. I'm going to talk about how we raise our children. But this does have a spiritual purpose here, that we need more children. And here's where I'm going to get to the point where I may offend some of us, but I'll try to clean it up before I'm done. As much as we would resist the idea of being pro-choice, I'm afraid we've become far more pro-choice than we would ever care to admit. And don't misunderstand me. I'm not equating the decision to not have children with the action of murdering a child in the womb, which is the way pro-choice is used in our culture. Those are two radically different actions with radically different consequences. But they're sometimes motivated by the same feelings. There's sometimes the same view of children among maybe some of us as to why we wouldn't want to have very many, as to how they impact our life. It's my life, it's my choice. Now, I know we're making that decision at a different point. And as a society, though, we're choosing to have fewer and fewer children for whatever reason. And I know there are some who have not made that choice, but they've not been blessed with children. In the lecture book, I specifically address the fact that single people or infertile people should not feel like they are not spiritual, or that they're a failure when it comes to fulfilling God's plan, that in some way they're failing a personal mandate from God. I don't believe that to be the case at all. However, I will mention there is a great opportunity for adoption in those cases. I was asked by several people if I was going to put in a shameless pitch for adoption or sacred selections. No, I'm not even going to mention that. But when we choose to limit our children, I sometimes wonder why. And there could be great reasons. Again, don't misunderstand me. God has given us the ability to reason, to think, to plan, and the decision to have children or not have children, or how many children that we want to have, is a personal decision. But such decisions should be made by considering how we can best fulfill the work of God, more than anything else. Not what we want, not what will make us feel better, not what will make us happy. Children will not make you happy. Have you seen them? That is not what it's about. That's not what I personally want to have. My own personal legacy, in some way fulfilling me. It's about serving God. And the reason that we think differently about children is because we've let the world influence us on what children are all about, what their purpose is, what role they play. The world asks why someone would go through all of the labor and expense and heartache and sacrifice and trouble of having children. And if one is thinking only of themselves, if they're motivated by greed and ambition and laziness or personal enjoyment, you probably wouldn't choose such an endeavor. Maybe someone who believed that children would bring an added level of joy to his or her life would embark on the journey of childbearing and child rearing, but only to the extent necessary to bring that joy. I want to have some joy. I think one can do it. I think two can do that for me. But if you understand the spiritual nature of bringing children into the world, you would not only be willing to be fruitful and multiply, but also thankful for the blessing that comes with being able to participate in the spiritual work. And I think there are a lot of things that we learn through this. That one might understand that the sacrifices made through the bearing of children helps us to become more spiritually minded. That we might understand what it means to serve without expecting anything in return. By the way, Jesus talked about that, didn't he? That principle, when you have a banquet, do for somebody who can't do back for you. That's what children are. You're providing for someone who can't provide anything in return. Maybe we'd have a better grasp of what unconditional love is all about, or why God uses the parent-child relationship to explain how he feels about us. And those are just some of the blessings that come from having children. That God loves people. That God sent his Son to die for people. And he wants to save as many as he possibly can. More people is not a problem. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Jesus said to receive a child in his name. That's what it's about. And I think among our families, we haven't lost that yet. We understand the blessing that comes from that. And we fought some against our culture that's promoting this small family mentality, this not having children, or at the most one or two. But we need to understand that this is part of the work that we can do. And there's a tremendous blessing that we can find in having these children. There's no greater impact that you can ever have in the world than what you can bring through a child. And let's make sure that we leave that as part of the family the way God ordained it. Procreation has a spiritual purpose. It's not about us. It's about serving God. I appreciate your time and your attention.